looking at the grey fleet again, then how do you go about answering some of the questions that our viewers can see on the presentation slides at the moment? You know, who is driving on business in your company? Some companies we may be talking about could be huge and very diverse and fragmented. That could be a massive undertaking to carry out that audit. What controls would you expect your clients to put in place? The permit to drive, we're going to talk about that in a few moments. But also, what about the standards of the cars that you'll be expecting people to be using? Because it seems to me like you're going to be expecting people to be driving environmentally friendly cars, frugal cars, not using too much fuel. They're going to have all the checks and balances in place, such as MOT and insurance. It's quite a big task, isn't it?
It's a daunting process, in that many companies don't actually have detailed knowledge of just who is driving on their business and who isn't. And for some businesses, we've sought to identify those people for them by modifying and working on their expenses program, just to see who's regularly claiming. I don't think we're going to find everybody at any particular time. It's difficult, but the responsibility is still there, and therefore we have to put some balances in place for those guys.
Absolutely. RAC Risk Management has devised a process.
We have, yeah.
There is a graph on screen, a graphical representation of it. It looks very, very clean, very ordered, very straightforward and easy to understand. A couple of things sitting under grey fleet, MOT and insurance checks. How valuable in the whole process is that when you're dealing with grey fleet vehicles?
Let's go back a mo, shall we? When a fleet operator acquires a fleet of motor cars, they make valued choices about the nature and type of the motor car based on the whole life cost, based on the eco input, maybe based on the NCAP safety regulations, and all of those principles ought to pass across to grey fleet, where we're supplying people with the cash and so on. So in effect, we ought to be asking the same standards from people who are being paid to run a motor car on behalf of the business. So we ought to be perhaps thinking in policy terms of the same sort of vehicles. Reality, of course, is we end up with a mishmash of vehicles, some of which are much older, some of which are certainly not the current crop of safety-equipped vehicles.
I think you mentioned earlier, isn't it, average age of 5 years old?
Well, certainly 5 years old and above would be the norm for a grey fleet vehicle. And we're, you know, whilst vehicle life is much extended, we are talking about areas where things begin to wear. And importantly, the latest developments are, in safety terms, are just not there. So issues about fitness for purpose and the maintenance of those vehicles in particular, because quite clearly people will not spend the money in anticipation, unlike a company car, where we have no doubts about its safety and its maintenance, and indeed the insurance situation. We know that fleet insurance is robust and covers people. Here with a grey fleet person, we're asking them to take all those responsibilities on the basis that we're trying to opt out of the responsibility ourselves. We're trying to shed the financial liability except for an expenses or a mileage account or whatever. But it's natural that people will seek to cut corners, and one of the areas they cut corners is typically maintenance, tyres in particular. Even in company car fleets, we see 1 in 10 cars having faulty tyres, and Steve and his team will do vehicle checks in various companies and come up with that stat. For grey fleet cars, we just don't know whether that number is the same or whether it's higher. My suspicion is it's much higher.
Well, you were talking of cutting corners. I'm going to cut corners right now, and I'm going to go straight to a question which has come in quite timely. And the reason I mentioned MOT and insurance check is that we've got a question come in from Denzel, and he asks, MOT test checks, does the panel believe, it's like question time this, isn't it? Does the panel believe it's sufficient for companies to annually check their driver employee MOTs, or should they be safety checking these vehicles more regularly with tyres and brakes? Steve, Dave mentioned that RAC provides vehicle inspection services. I don't want this to turn into
you don't want it to be a plug, but
big advert.
But thank you, Denzel. No, an MOT certificate is valid on the day that it's issued.
Yeah.
There's nothing to say that that vehicle becomes unroadworthy very shortly after the issuing of that certificate. So I believe there's a need for regular checking of vehicle safety, and whilst individuals should be doing those checks, carrying out those checks, there are people that aren't skilled in checking those, in carrying out those checks. Yeah. And whilst an MOT only checks the roadworthiness, it doesn't necessarily check for the reliability of the vehicle. So it's not checking fluid levels, for instance, which are some of the regular maintenance checks that should be carried out on a vehicle. And indeed, we run a number of programs for organisations through RAC inspections where we carry out duty of care inspections, which is safety inspections, so tyre condition, tyre wear, but also fluid level checks. So we're trying to keep on top of the maintenance of the vehicles to improve the reliability of them. And so, to answer Denzel's question, in my opinion, no, it's not enough to just annually check. There should be more regular checks of those.
And would this be enshrined in the policy, Dave? Could you stipulate in the policy that that's what needs to be happening?
I think that's right. Clearly, line managers have a responsibility to physically check. And it's not difficult just to go and have a walk round and see if the thing is clean and properly prepared. And people will accompany you on a sales visit or whatever. At the same time, those checks can be done. I just perceive that we forget. We leave it to the other person, and it just doesn't happen.
What ways do you know of for encouraging participation and support for these kinds of initiatives? I mean, if you look at our graphic there, the permit to drive at the bottom is in green, which is the nice green for go, safety, all's fine. Is there any sense that acquiring a permit to drive in itself is an incentive? Is there any sense of achievement for drivers? And are there other ways of motivating people to take responsibility for their vehicles, doing regular vehicle checks, checking your tyres every day or whatever it's decreed?
I guess it's how you sell it in the business. I mean, clearly people don't like regulation being thrust at them. But to be fair, what we're doing here is investing in individual persons' safety. It's a benefit they take home with them to their wives and families and so on. So the permit to drive is effectively an internal document, isn't it? It's an authority to drive your motor vehicle on business. And yes, in some businesses, without that permit, you are forbidden to do that. It would be a misconduct process. And you might find that your ability to claim expenses for that business journey without a permit is just not there. So there are some steps here, and those steps in grey fleet vehicles are taking reasonable steps to ensure that the vehicle is properly maintained and fit for purpose and insured. And we haven't touched on the insurance bit.
Well, I wanted to talk about insurance next, because if by magic there we have on the screen, you can see all there the grey fleet checks that are in place. And it includes DVLA registration lookup, and that would also check for road tax, driving licence, and all the various things that are handled by VOSA for MOT. But there is the insurance cover, which stipulates quite clearly it needs to be business cover. Are there various degrees of business cover? Is it possible to have business cover but the wrong kind or not enough? Is that something you've encountered?
In reality, what's necessary is to tell your insurer precisely what you're going to do with the vehicle. We know very well that to make false claims and false declarations to them to give wrong information might invalidate a claim. So they have to know precisely what you're going to be doing. And for most people, if they are driving a grey fleet vehicle on occasional business trips, the odd trip to another branch, the odd trip to a course and so on, effectively the insurer would absorb that and cover them for that business at no extra cost. If, however, you're a cash for car person and you're using the vehicle in completely different circumstances, then the insurer needs to know what the mileage and exposure is going to be, what the nature of your the geography, the timing, that sort of stuff. So there are varying degrees of cover and varying premiums because of circumstance, and that's only right. What we see is people trying to buy insurance cover as cheaply as possible, and without looking closely, many of them buy insurance that doesn't cover them for the activity that they're undertaking. So we see some insurances that don't even cover you to commute to work, and huge issues if something goes wrong.
Right, okay. Now I'm going to move you forward a little bit faster now, because I'd like to get into describing the process of the risk assessment, Dave. So if you can take us through the points that a driver is likely to encounter as they experience a risk assessment.
I guess what we're trying to achieve is a prioritization of who needs training, if at all, and who needs it most. And there's some historical stuff to be considered there, which typically would be in your personal driver profile. So, have you had training? What's your accident record like? The sort of things that an insurer would ask you about your personal and private insurance policy. So they would want to gauge your experience and background in motoring. And we need to do that too. But in addition to that, we need to look at some other factors, typically exposure, because there is a correlation between the mileage that you might cover and your exposure to other people. So even though you become an experienced motorist of good record, if you're doing 30 or 40,000 miles a year, your risk level might be high based on the time you put yourself in a mix with other people, because we know most of them are driving on autopilot most of the time. One of the virtues of our particular program is that we are covering the vehicle risk and the maintenance process as well. So a fleet manager needs to demonstrate, or a fleet person needs to demonstrate, that they are taking proper care of the motor vehicle and can demonstrate that from records. And this part of the risk assessment will help. Clearly there's a driver administration part, and that's about capturing insurance and grey fleet vehicle details so that we are fully aware. And there's an ergonomics part for, do you fit your motor car, and does it fit you, and do you suffer from backache and so on. And I guess what we're trying to do, we're trying to take the historical evidence, some of which we'll get from claims experience, and a basis for propensity to have accidents going forward, on which we make judgments about what level of training is appropriate.
So if I understand it right then, the driver risk assessment then leads into a decision as to what kind of training, if any training is appropriate, would be required to manage that particular driver's risk. And the options, as we see, are non-required, so that driver is deemed to be safe and
for the time being
relatively low risk. E-learning. What would a driver expect if they were assigned an e-learning course?
Typically there's a number of online modules covering varying subjects from your fitness to drive through actual driving behaviour, but also covering some of the technical bits too, the the use of ABS, anti-lock braking systems, the use of electronic stability programs. Most drivers, sadly, we find don't have that technical knowledge and therefore are ill-equipped to use the safety features of that motor car when things go wrong. And so within the e-learning program, as well as in the driver training program, there are modules that will explain visually and video clips and so on to illustrate how that will work for people.
Indeed, during the bad weather recently, the RAC got an awful lot of calls from drivers saying my brakes are faulty because I'm getting a strange vibrating sensation through the pedal.
Oh, okay. They weren't familiar with the effect of ABS.
Absolutely. They just said they'd never experienced it before because they hadn't seen it activated on the vehicle. So don't underestimate the lack of knowledge of some of this technology out there.
And if it were a machine tool, you would be expected to be taught how to use it.
Absolutely.
If it's a motor car, somehow we assume
everyone knows.
That everyone knows. Reality, of course, most people haven't updated their knowledge since taking the driving test, however long that might have been.
Do you find e-learning is the end result for most drivers, having undergone the risk assessment, or what proportion end up going to the next level, which is driver awareness training, which is a little bit more kind of hands-on and practical? And
well, the norm used to be driver training.
Yeah.
If we went back 6 or 7 years, the norm in training then was that most people would undertake driver training because it's the most proven way of reducing accident stats, frequency and cost. These days, because the regulations have come in, it quite clearly allows us to prioritise, and the training has been tuned, as it were, to achieve the same reduction figures by concentrating on those people who need it most. So, yes, there are flags, as it were, green, amber and red flags to suggest that you would benefit most from this type of training or that type of training. In hands-on training, that's very much new knowledge because it's about the physical human side of driver performance rather than the system side of which gear are you in and stop hanging onto the gear lever and don't cross your hands, because people don't crash for those reasons. They crash because they're not paying attention. And that's what we need to deal with.
Is there any stigma attached to anybody being referred for driver awareness training? Is it?
They all say, I don't need this, don't they? We're all good drivers, and the more senior you are in the business, the less you need it. But in reality, of course, when we get to face those people, generally they come back and admit, why didn't I know all that stuff before? I quite enjoyed the way it was done because that's the ethos of how we do it. And they come back having bought into the process. And we meet people 10 years later who say, if it hadn't been for what your guys taught me, David, then things would have been very different. And can my wife do it, and can my kids do it, please?
Yeah, that's interesting that they want to extend the experience
Indeed.
to their family, and
Absolutely.
because they feel it's made them a safer driver, and
Absolutely.
they would like
And factually, because we measure the performance of fleets as part of the programme all of the time, we know that the accident numbers come down 20, 30, 40, 50% without fail.
Our next slide, we've touched on many of the aspects, although you talk a little bit about the Corporate Manslaughter Act and the Road Safety Act 2006 and the Health and Safety Offences Act, all of which have made this business much more serious, Dave, hasn't it? It's no longer something that can be swept under the carpet. And am I right in believing that if you are subject to a road death investigation, that can be pretty traumatic experience? Nothing as traumatic as being killed, I'm sure, but you know, the idea of being investigated is pretty horrendous.
Let's get this in perspective. The driver will never lose his individual responsibility for poor behaviour. That will always be the case. What we have now, though, is as an employer, you are responsible for his poor behaviour, or might be as well. And clearly, the way that accidents are now being investigated, you will understand, you will have already been aware that whenever there's a big accident, the road is closed for a significant period of time, quite often a whole day, that there is a full forensic examination and scientific examination of what's happened, and that there is an investigation team that likens to a suspicious murder death type investigation. And part of the responsibility of the police investigating officers is to go and look and see within the business to see whether you've got a component contribution that may have added to that process. So it could be areas of fatigue or mobile telephones or whatever, but the police officer will come and interview you and will want to see the evidence of process and practice that you're in. And quite clearly, if you can demonstrate that there is a record of training that applies to this particular person, that the risk assessment is in place, that his eyesight's checked, that his licence has been checked, that you've checked the safety of the vehicle and the insurance cover, then what you're doing is demonstrating that you've taken reasonable steps, which is what the law asks you to do.
Huge benefit in itself, but Steve, there are other benefits.
Yeah, and let's not forget the biggest benefit is about saving lives. And whilst there's a moral benefit and a legal benefit to the business, and we've talked about the reduction in the number of accidents and the cost savings to a business, not only in the reduction of accidents, but the reduction in cost in terms of fuel spend and more economical driving. Saving lives is the primary objective here, rather than saving money.
But there is evidence that demonstrates that risk management is not financially penalising. There are savings that far outweigh the actual cost of the exercise, and that can be demonstrated.
As part of the function that we undertake, we undertake an audit at the beginning of any programme with a view to put in some numbers in place so that we have some measurement. Quite clearly, throughout the programme, you would measure yourself and the company against those original numbers, and we would expect to see a reduction, and generally that is the case. At the same time, we put together a cost-benefit analysis of how the programme components might cost you, what the expected benefits are likely to be in terms of reduction of accident frequency and cost, in terms of fuel consumption, and let's not forget the hidden cost too. So the time off the road is just the same. Yeah. And that applies to grey fleet vehicles too. So even if your asset is not owned by you, the cost of an accident might still be attributable to the company. And I've yet to come across a business where there isn't a spend to save situation on a relationship of, for every pound you spend, you might expect to save a fiver. So that's the sort of ratio.
A win-win.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We have time for a few questions.
Okay.
Great.
And so I'll have a quick read of what some of our viewers have been sending in. And the first one at the top of the list, we'll go with this one. The question is, can a company legally stop an individual driving his own vehicle on company business? Or can they make him/her repair vehicle faults?
I think you need to write your policy in such a way that driving a vehicle in those circumstances becomes a discipline issue. We see many companies create policies where serious fault accident, serious driver misbehaviour is classified as gross misconduct. So physically, can you stop him? No. but certainly you have control in terms of the HR process and discipline, provided you write your policy correctly.
It's all down to the word in the policy. Our next question is, what are the implications if a third party, such as your tyre supplier, for example, checks the vehicle as you organise on their behalf, but makes an error, such as not noticing damage? So how does that leave you vulnerable?
Well, there's been a prosecution, actually. A 4x4 vehicle went for service and was collected by the company car driver, who set off down the motorway and had an accident which involved the vehicle rolling over and crossing the central reservation. The police examination of that vehicle realised that the rear tyre pressures of the vehicle were soft, which contributes to its instability. And what happened was that the servicing agent was prosecuted for his negligence, but the company employing the driver, who was now no longer with us, the company employing the driver couldn't show that they had taught the guy how to check the vehicle for himself, and they were found guilty of a failure of duty of care. So you can't outsource the responsibility. You need to be able to teach people precisely what their best practice is, and hence the e-learning program covers areas of tyres and coolant and oil and all those lights and horn and indicators as part of a vehicle check on a regular basis.
Thank you. Is there any legislation or case law that states a driver who drives their own vehicle on business has to provide a copy of their original driving licence for inspection? Is it a legal requirement?
No, not as I understand it. But the way it's put is quite different. If a person has a driving licence, that's absolutely how it should be. And failing to have a valid driving licence is an offence. If as an employer you allow that person to drive on your business, then you cause or permit him to commit that offence, and you effectively become exactly the same as if you committed the offence yourself. So whilst the law doesn't specifically say it's an offence, it does provide you with justification for checking.
And it's all about surely wording the policy correctly again.
Indeed.
So
yeah.
you don't give permission to drive unless they can produce a copy of the driving licence, or permit you
we
do licence checking,
know, of
which
course,
is actually more important.
that people avoid such things, and we see it all the time.
Thank you. Steve, I've got one for you. Should a company car driver attempt to change a wheel at the side of the road?
In short, no. If you're on a free running road, be that a dual carriageway, the hard shoulder on a motorway, my recommendation is get out of the car, get the other side of the barrier, and all of your family members. Something like a third of all deaths on motorways are when a vehicle's stationary on a hard shoulder. It's an extremely dangerous place to be, and you certainly don't want to be the person changing a wheel there. Get an expert in who can put the precautions in place.
And manage the risk, yeah.
And manage the risk.
Expert in an orange van, though.
Expert in an orange van would be absolutely ideal. That is, of course, if you've got a spare wheel.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah,
Because a lot of manufacturers now are not providing spare wheels in order to save the CO2 emissions because of the weight of carrying a spare wheel around.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, then, Steve. Questions are still coming in, which is great, because the clock's ticking down, but we're still getting questions. So we'll keep going for a few more minutes. Right. Why have there not been more prosecutions under the Corporate Manslaughter Act to date?
Can I answer that one?
Over to you, David.
Because the Corporate Manslaughter Act demands evidence of a gross breach, which effectively means that people have done nothing at all. But it does provide for a lesser prosecution of failure of duty of care. And whilst we're not seeing headline cases of corporate manslaughter, we are seeing many, many more cases of failure amongst big corporations failing for duty of care. And if one cares to go and look at the record, you will have seen a couple of serious events in the last fortnight alone. So the prosecutions are there, but they're being dealt with as failures rather than as gross breach.
Mm.
Right. Well, it's nearly time to wind up, but we've got one viewer who's sent in 2 questions in rapid succession, and there is a question that I'd like to ask, and then there's a kind of a fairly normal question. I'm going to ask both, actually. I'll ask the normal question first, and it's one for Steve. Would RAC inspections and RAC risk management be able to do a combined package to help combat risks from grey fleet?
Indeed,
yes,
That's
of course.
something that you
Absolutely,
can bundle
yes.
stuff together.
Yes, please.
And this gentleman's final question, which I think will be the one that we'll close on, is there a difference between gender risks? Now, I'm not sure how we interpret gender risk, but I think what the gentleman means is there any difference in risk levels of men and women drivers?
I'm going to leave that to you.
I thought you might. What you're asking me is whether men or ladies are more dangerous. All I'm going to say is that there is good evidence to show that young lady business drivers have become more aggressive than previously.
The alpha female.
Okay. Is that all you're going to tell us?
That's all I'm going to say. Yeah,
what about generally, though? Isn't it a well-known fact that women are deemed lower risk, less likely to have accidents?
I'm not going to be drawn.
I think I remember writing 1 or 2 insurance company stories at Fleet News that, that sort of alluded to that kind of conclusion.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, let's hope our viewer is happy with that answer. Okay. Well, I said at the beginning of the programme that the contact details for RAC Fleet Risk Management are there for you all to note down. We hope you enjoyed this RAC Fleet Risk Management webinar. You can download the presentation and contact RAC Risk Management using any of the methods listed there on screen. So on behalf of Dave, Steve and myself, thank you all very much for watching.
Thank you.